Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one, we start out in direction of the Zaporizhzhia region, where we see that the Russians continue pushing here to the west of Kalinina across the canal, where they are slowly improving their positions to capture the remaining parts of the micro-district. The Ukrainians still have several units here in the northern direction, both in the forest area and the different defensive positions that the Ukrainians have prepared here in the northern flank. And this results in slow advances by the Russians, but they have advanced this small part with the shielded footage confirming the advance and the Russian presence here. In the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have also made a small advance, as is seen with this geolocated footage here. The Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back in the residential areas here in the eastern parts of the city, while heavy fighting continues in the apartment complex areas in the central parts, and the Russians have yet to enter the industrial zone in the western parts of the city. Generally, the areas with heavy fighting is along the front line in the southern micro-district of Toretsk, the central part around the high-rise apartment complex area, and the residential area in the eastern parts. The Ukrainians still have fortified positions here in the northeastern parts of the city, preventing the Russians from flanking their positions here in the central parts of Toretsk near the residential areas. The Russians are pushing through the central parts in a head-on attack, but at the same time, the main push is taking place here in the apartment complex area. The Russians are also attempting at the same time to close the gap here between the two sides by connecting the two sides while they push the Ukrainians out of the forest area. Pushing the Ukrainians out of the forest area and connecting the southern parts with the central parts of the city will allow the Russians to consolidate their gains, strengthening their eastern positions and supply lines into the city, to then develop offensive operations towards the heights in the western parts of the city. Gaining control of those will force the Ukrainians to withdraw from the parts here by Nelipivka all the way to Sherbinivka, and the Russians will then also be able to launch operations into that in the western flank of Toretsk. The current main operation of the Russians is to avoid the high ground fortified positions by the Ukrainians as much as possible by fighting within the city itself and bypassing the defenses by flanking them from the north once they capture the city. Therefore, the Ukrainians are focusing their forces here in the western parts to take as much advantage of this as possible by heavily bombarding the Russian positions in New York to prevent offensive operations in the northern direction. Although the Russians managed to gain a foothold here by Leonidivka, there's been no updates since. It is likely due to how difficult it is for the Russians to expand their positions or even to hold these positions, which is putting a lot of pressure on the Russian forces there, but it is likely combined with offensive operations from the northeast to support those forces by spreading out the Ukrainian forces and forcing a withdrawal from Nelipivka. Further south here in the direction of Vuhledar, we see several Russian advances. The Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of the first coal mine here to the northeast of Vuhledar. This allows the Russians to have very close proximity positions to the final road in and out of Vuhledar. The Ukrainians are unable to properly use this road, but with a combined effort through the cover of the forest lines, they could switch over to that road. However, now that the Russians have such close proximity to the road, the Ukrainians are now forced to one singular exit, and that is continuously pushing through the fields all the way to the road here to the northwest of Vuhledar. And this whole area here north of Vuhledar is constantly under Russian surveillance and fire. At night time, we see videos such as this one with the Russians using some of their Dragon drones, which are drones that spray molten metals down into the forest areas where the extremely high heat prevents the Ukrainians from using the forest lines as a cover, and at the same time forces them to then move out in the open in between the forest lines, and that allows for more accurate artillery strikes on those positions. At the same time, there's also footage such as this one where the Russians are using thermite bombs across the entirety of Vuhledar. We see some of the garages here in the bottom of the video, and the high-rise apartment complexes is in the top part. So we see that this thermite bombing is happening in Vuhledar, and it is heavily affecting the Ukrainian forces in the area. We see how it is concentrated on the Ukrainian held positions. The Ukrainians still have a significant amount of troops within Vuhledar, and they don't really hold that many positions left now that the Russians have managed to capture additional apartment complex buildings and have moved to school number 2 here within Vuhledar. With this, the Russians continue their advance and pushing the Ukrainians out of their well-fortified positions within the city, and as was seen with the footage, majority of the buildings within Vuhledar still holds despite the almost 3-year-long battles over the city. This means that these buildings really are indestructible in terms of the firepower that the Russians are using within the city during this entire time period of fighting. This also means that it is very difficult for the Russians to take control over these buildings. They have to storm them one by one with, of course, heavy fire support, but they still need to clear the buildings, the basements, and everything in between, and the Ukrainians are simply not surrendering and not withdrawing. Withdrawal is almost impossible and would simply be putting themselves into the open field. So I believe the Ukrainians right now are just attempting to buy as much time as possible by holding the city for as long as possible. This is with a belief that the Ukrainians will launch a counterattack to open up the playing field a bit to avoid the encirclement and open up for either withdrawal or simply to push the Russians out by re-establishing control over the flanks. So we see that the Ukrainians may be launching a counterattack in the future to support the defense of the city or to push out the Ukrainians, allowing for a withdrawal. However, no such evidence has been shown that the Ukrainians will be launching any sort of counterattack, and time is running out for the remaining soldiers within Vuhledar. At the same time, with the control over the remaining parts of the coal mine, it allows the Russians to have a strong flank to the north of the city. At the same time, the Russians have aligned control of the road here in the western parts, which means that the gap in which the Ukrainian positions are present is very small. The Ukrainians' best bet at launching a successful counterattack here in the direction of Vuhledar would be to hit the western flank of Vuhledar to reach the river line and cut off the Russian forces in the western bank. However, the main presence of Russian forces is from the eastern flank, which means that the Ukrainians would have to cut that one off to re-establish control over the eastern flanks. So this would be an assault with the purpose of withdrawing the soldiers from the city and not to cancel the siege. If the Ukrainians want to cancel the siege, they need to regain control over this mine here to the northeast of Vuhledar and then push towards Mikilske, which would be a large push in an open field where Russians have lots of firepower. So that is a very difficult and dangerous mission and could cost more than could be benefited from such a counterattack. Therefore, it is likely that the Ukrainians have set the fate of the city in stone, as they likely do not believe that they can regain control over the flanks or allow the Ukrainian soldiers to withdraw. Therefore, we'll either see that the 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces will be wiped out, or that they will surrender to the Russian forces. And that is a very difficult position for the Ukrainians because they are already lacking in manpower, and the next lines of defense are completely insignificant compared to Vuhledar, which has held for 2 years and 7 months compared to, well, anywhere else on the front line that hasn't held for nearly as long. Finally, in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, the Russians have increased the range of their FAB bombs to approximately 85-kilometer range. This is how we see videos such as this one, where the Russians are bombing positions within the city of Zaporizhzhia itself with FAB bombs. The Ukrainian air defense, mainly the Patriot systems, are located near the city of Dnipro, which is approximately 80 kilometers from the front line, and the Russians, with a range of 80 kilometers, can stay just outside the range of the Patriot systems with about 150-kilometer range. the Russians would be firing from 160 kilometers away. This means that the Ukrainians would be forced to either send their Patriot systems closer to the front line, which would allow them to still continue defending Zaporizhzhia, but they'll also make them more vulnerable. And we already saw over the past few months the Russians targeting some of these Patriot systems here in the Dnipro region, which could even have forced the Ukrainians to push them further back to keep them safe due to a Russian bombing. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to re-establish the air defense of Zaporizhzhia and other frontline cities such as Sumy and Kharkiv, which are now constantly being bombed by FAB bombs, which is hitting both the energy industry and much else, mostly industrial targets, but also troop gatherings and other such targets. And this has allowed the Russians to replace extremely expensive missiles during the massive missile strikes with FAB bombs, which are much cheaper and they can be fired at a constant pace and large numbers, which means that the potential targets has also increased significantly within these frontline cities.